I'll present my entire screen today because I want to go between two windows. Okay, can you see my window?
Yes, sir.
Just a moment, I have to close the door. Okay, so what we will do today is the following. We will intuitively develop, we already intuitively developed the some mathematical formalism, but we will move on this direction and go a little more formal on that. So we will start with, as I said in the last lecture, that there are 9 different way to formulate the reality, to the quantum mechanical reality, which the main thing about that is superposition and uncertainty. And there are 9 different ways to formulate that, and in this course, so we will focus on the matrix mechanics way and the wave mechanics way. So we have already discussed, and maybe you have already learned about the wave mechanics way in the previous course, so it is not an entirely new thing to you, but most likely this matrix mechanics is a bit new to you. So we will develop it slowly, and then in this course that will be our primary focus. And then we will, after we develop these two formalisms, we will learn to apply them for various practical scenarios, because as I said, that at the end of the day, a task of a physicist is to boil down a however abstract concept you have, however abstract theory you have to boil down to a measurable quantity, bring it down to a measurable quantity, and predict what will happen if you measure that. A measurement device will, usually all the measurement device will give you a number, a real number, and whatever your fancy theory is, whatever finer details you are talking about must boil down to that number. Until you do that, it is not a scientific theory, it is like a opinion or a philosophy. Okay, so that you have to so that is what we will learn how to do eventually in the rest of the course. Okay, so now let me enter into this formalism. So this matrix mechanics formalism was originally first, this line of thinking was introduced by Heisenberg, and he came up with this idea even without knowing what is a matrix. So it was a very what will I say, it was a very informal way of developing it intuitively, and later Dirac consolidated this whole thing into a very well organized and well oiled machinery, that how to calculate things just from this matrix mechanics. So this Dirac's formalism is called bracket formalism. So what is the idea there? So you realize from the superposition principle, and already we have discussed this, that you need a structure. In superposition principle tells you that to describe the state of a quantum mechanical system, you need a structure where if you add two states, so let's say if you add two states like that, alpha plus beta, with some coefficient C1, C2, you get another state, let's say gamma. This is the kind of structure you need, and this C1, C2 can be complex number. And the most obvious choice that where you have this kind of structures is vectors. So then Dirac came onto this conclusion that a formal structure must need a vector in order to describe a quantum mechanical state. So the first postulate he made, that the state of a physical system is specified by a vector, and that is in the complex vector space, because we established already that we need complex numbers to describe it. So that's why it has to be in the complex vector space. And then the dimension of that vector space depends on the number of possible values one can get by performing a measurement. So it's the configuration space of that. So that not only depends on the system, of course, it also depends on the measurement. Because for example, an electron, if you measure the position of an electron, there are infinite possible spaces. So that is one kind of measurement. But if you measure the spin of an electron, there are only two possibilities, that is plus up and minus up. That was established by Stern-Gerlach experiment. So depending on what kind of property you are looking for, so that tells you that what is the configuration space, how many states that particle can be in, and that tells you what will be the dimension of that vector space which is describing that state. So, as I said, the Stern-Gerlach apparatus tells you there are two possible states, and the double slit tells you there are infinite possibles. So, let me quickly revisit that what are these vectors and how do you efficiently describe them. So, you know, like by now, of course, a lot about vectors. So vectors are basically a three vector. You can write it as a three component object, which is x, y, which is, you can write it abstractly like that. And if you consider the scalars a, b, c, are reserved for expressing scalar. So when a vector is multiplied by a scalar, it's still another vector. So addition of two vector will give you another vector. That these things you know. And the vector addition is commutative, associative, and distributive over addition, which means if you multiply this, sorry, here this bar should not be here, because I mean to say just the a. So a scalar multiplication with the vector addition is distributive over addition. So there must exist a zero vector state, and which give you, when you add it with the vector, it will give you the same vector, return you the same vector, and a negative vector, which when added will give you nothing, basically the zero vector. So you have to also define a null vector, and this null vector is defined here. And two vectors of the same dimension can be multiplied to give a scalar, which is, you know, as the dot product, x dot y. So you know all of these properties, and all of these properties turn out to be useful. For example, we have established in this modified Stern-Gerlach setup that you can add two vectors in a way such that you get 0 in one direction and 0 in the minus z beam, and plus z beam becomes +1. So that's where you realize that you have to create the provision of this kind of complete destruction of a vector by another vector, and that will happen by this negative vector. So all of these properties will come useful. So this is where I am trying to build up the need for that, and then I will of course formally describe it. And at this point I must tell you that the best place to read about this subject is Dirac's book. Of course, that's because he developed this subject. Other books will give you a little axiomatic feeling. They will kind of tell you, oh, this is that, that is that. But Dirac's book, which is a little bit difficult to read, will tell you the train of thoughts which led him to this kind of thing. So that is very important to get that perspective, that where you kind of know that how someone came with this kind of description, rather than saying that this is a correct description. Because other books, like most books, will start with the set of rules, and then they will say, look, this represents that. It is not easy to come up with something from nothing, and that's what Dirac did, and that's why Dirac's approach is the best approach. Okay, so now let's see.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Could you explain the line that is written in double slit in the last slide? Yeah.
Which line?
The, below SG double slit. What is written there?
Oh, position and momentum of electron, which are non-denumerable. I even, it's like a tongue twister. Denumerably infinite. So that means you cannot count, because it's a real number. It's uncountably infinite. That is what it means. Is it clear?
What are we referring to as being infinite here?
Yeah, infinite means the position of an object in space is represent, say, even one dimensional space. Let's say you have a one dimensional place. The position of an object in this one dimensional space is a real number, right?
Yeah, but why are we referring to it in the double slit experiment?
Yeah, so the double slit experiment, when you refer to X and S, so this X, where it can be on this one-dimensional plane, that's a positionally, that's a infinite dimensional space, right?
Okay, okay, okay.
In that
Got it.
sense,
Got it.
yeah, it's a real number in that sense. Okay, so now here is a little bit of something which you probably have not thought very carefully before. So how many of you know these kind of things, that a square integrable function is actually a vector? Are you familiar with these statements?
No, sir.
Okay, so now we have established that to represent a quantum mechanical state, you need a vector or a vector space, and the abstract definition of vector space is this. And the common kind of, when you say vector, the kind of thing which comes in your head is probably this kind of objects, and you know that this kind of object fits this description, but there are many other kind of objects which do look nothing like this, they are also vectors. So they are also strictly speaking vector in a mathematical sense because they satisfy these properties. So we will we as I now we will see that even the functions which a square integrable function, which is a kind of function you need to describe a wave packet or a wave, is also a vector. So let's say what is the meaning of square integrable function? A square integral function is the one for which this kind of objects are well defined. Like if I take a function fx and gx, the fx mod square dx and gx mod square dx are well defined object. And you know that you realize this kind of object to describe a wave function, and the square in dx tells you what is the probability of finding that particle in region between x and x plus dx. And when you integrate over the entire space, this gives you the entire probability, and that should be equal to 1. So you know that you need the kind of function you need to represent a wave function in space is a square integrable function, and they happen to be also vectors. Why? Because they have all these properties, that a fx, when you multiply it by a scalar, is also square integrable. The fx plus gx is also square integrable and have all these property, which is commutative, associative, multiplicative. Multiplication is distributive over addition. Addition of scalar is compatible uh, over multiplication, and vector, and this kind of associativity. Okay, distributivity. There exists a zero and negative, and the inner product is a scalar. So all these properties, by scalar I mean this is just one number. So if you integrate over this space, you get a one number, a single number. Okay, it's not a function over infinite space, and you can even think it like an infinite dimensional vector, because every point in the x space, linear, in the line x, can be thought of as a point in this point of this vector, and you can treat it like an infinite dimensional vector. But a more less confusing way to talk about it is just to treat it as a function, but this function has all the properties which a vector space needs to satisfy. So I want you to convince yourself just by all these sub properties, but this point is clear so far, right? Okay, I assume it is clear, because if you are completely silent, it is generally my assumption will be everything is super clear. Okay. Now we'll learn a few concepts called linear independence and basis. This is also something you already know, so I'll quickly go over this. So a set of collection of vectors, which is x1. So let me enlarge it a bit. It will be useful if I think it is not so easy to see. A set of collection of vectors. Yeah.
Sorry, so how would you describe a function, a square integrable function as a vector? Like you mentioned that you take each point as x and then infinite dimensional.
Yeah, that's what so first thing is that I want you to first think in terms of, I will come back to this point again, but if I define a vector like this, first of all, let me tell me this. If a vector is defined by this, that if I have an object, abstract object called x, which satisfy these four properties, so do you agree that this square integral function will satisfy this Well, there are some of the things I have not shown you, but let me just tell you that it satisfies these properties. Will you agree that a square integral function satisfies all the properties which a vector should satisfy?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so now
No,
if you
but
agree
we
to this,
satisfy all of this only under the integral, right?
yes, yes, only that is also important, that what kind of operation I am talking about. But in but the definition includes this point. So any function doesn't satisfy this. A function which has this property that these objects are well defined will satisfy this. Okay, this is a very important point. You don't need this. You will need this property in order to these properties to be satisfied. So in the space of all functions, only functions which have this property, they satisfy this. Is that clear?
So the last point where you say inner product of f dot g,
Yes.
so we are defining a new inner product here as integral of f dot g, right?
Yes. It's
So-
it's a new definition.
Okay.
Yeah, it is not the traditional definition of, so inner product is not necessarily the only one kind of thing. So if you define an inner product like that, then it satisfies this property. So the
Okay.
inner product for square integral function is given by this. Now up to this is clear, right?
Right.
Okay, now it turns out you can describe this kind of a function as in this form. So if it is not fully clear by this statement, I'll make it clear after some time. So you can write it as some xf. Okay, so you can imagine this f is some vector and x is some vector, and it's an infinite dimensional vector. So it's a column vector, you can think it as, which is infinite dimensional. Okay, where unlike in the previous case, you have treated it like some finite dimensional object. So this infinite, if you think it as an infinite dimensional vector, then you can again come back to all these properties. But and so in this case, you will define this scalar product as a scalar product between this f vector, f transpose, and g. So f is written as a row column vector, and g is written a row vector, and g is written as a column vector, and then you define it like this. And because then you sum over these, and this dx is, so you can always write a integral as a sum, right? As a Riemann sum, you can write it as a Riemann sum.
Yeah.
So, but it's a Riemann sum of infinitely many points, right? So you can treat this as a discrete object in this Riemann sum sense, and then you can again come back to this definition. So then a Riemann sum becomes an integral when there are infinitely many points, right? In the limiting case. So in that sense, you can treat these f and g's as if they are like just like those vectors, only if they are infinite dimensional. Is this point kind of intuitively clear?
Yes, sir. Understood.
Okay, so that is why even a typical wave function, which you have learned so far in previous course and somewhere maybe by self study, are also vectors. So to strictly speaking, to represent a quantum mechanical state, you need a vector. So there is a question probably. Can someone read that out to me? I heard a sound. Which
So isn't
like a question.
here x isn't one dimensional, right? You take it as a general vector like thing.
Yeah. So that is right. So this is good point. So x is one dimensional, of course, but if you want, you can also. So that is our way to think about this. Say, oh, x is one dimension, xy is 2D, xyz is 3D, three orthogonal direction. But when you try to define in this way, there are some other complications, because this x basis, when you say every point of real number space is a vector, you treat it like a component of a vector, some complication arises, which is related to orthonormality and completeness and all that. So it is a different way to think that every point on the real number space is a component of a vector, and that will give, there are some definition issues which I'll come back later. But intuitively, I'm just asking you to think it like that as if this fx is not a function, but it is like a vector, because what this fx does, this fx converts, it takes some numbers x and transfer it to some number fx, and for every x1 x2 xn you can treat each of these numbers as if they are components of a vector and treat it like that, which is analogous to saying that x is x1 x2 x3, like these three components like that. But there are some orthonormality related issue and completeness related issue which I'll come back to. But intuitively you can still think it like that. So is it clear? Or at least partially clear? So these components of x, this vector x, are scalars. So these are real numbers. So here I am saying this x is a vector whose components are real number x1, x2, x2, like infinity, which are each point of this real number space. So in that sense, I am saying it as a vector. Okay. Yeah, fx is a scalar, but if I want to, so in what sense it is a scalar? Fx is a scalar in the sense that if you put any number x, you will get another number. But if I say that if you put infinitely many numbers like a vector, then you get another set of infinite numbers. So if I say it like that, then it appears like a vector. But there are some subtleties which I'll come back later. But is this point clear so far? If this point is not clear, you can at least accept this definition.
Sir?
Even if that point is, yeah, I'll address your question. Even if this particular point is clear, you can at least accept this definition where you don't need to subscribe this way of thinking. You can say that just fx and gx, which satisfy these two property, follow this set of rules. That means they are vector in the same sense. These guys are vector. They are vector in the same sense. These guys are vector, because in a strict mathematical sense, a vector is defined as something which, when you add two vectors, you get another vector. When you multiply by scalar, you get another vector. It follows this kind of property. It has a zero, it has a negative, and it has an inner product. So if you define it that way, even by strict definition, you will land on the conclusion that these are vectors. But I'm giving you an intuitive way to think about it. Okay. Yeah. So the question.
So if we take each point on the real line, like you said in the one-dimensional case, to be components of the vector, then when we are talking about a specific point, aren't we just having that particular component and not the others?
Yeah. So if okay, so let me clarify this question. So when I'm talking about a specific point, I can think it like this again. I can think it like this. So only that point is not, let's say, non-zero, and all other points are zero. Then I can operate with that point, right?
Yes, sir.
I can manipulate with that point. So I'm taking this set of infinite numbers as one vector and treating it like a vector.
Okay. So you're considering all the other components to be zero except that particular point.
When I'm talking about picking up only one point.
Okay.
But this is, as I said, it is an intuitive way of thinking, because strictly speaking, when you apply the definitions, there will be some issues. But it is still, so as I said, so you can, so I will come back to this later again, and then you will realize it much more clearly. But even if you think, at least, well, there is no issues in these 4 points, but there will be other issues when you try to define orthonormality and all those things. But there is no issues, at least in this level. So you can convince yourself that if you have a function f and you have another function g, which are two infinite dimensional vectors, when they added, they give you another infinite dimensional vector, and they have this property. But even if you don't like this way of thinking, at least these 4 properties hold, as I said. So these 4 properties hold, which means they are still vectors. Is this much is clear at least?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So now I will go further and try to define some more properties, which you again already know, and I'll go a little fast, which is something called linear independence and basis. So let's take a collection of vectors, which is x1 to xn. So we will call them linearly independent if it is impossible to find n non-zero numbers such that this is satisfied. Okay. So this is simply called the linear independence property. And usually when you refer to a vector space, you say that the dimension of the vector space is the largest size of linearly independent collection of vectors. So you say that, oh, so we start from a vector x1. If you cannot find any vector x2 such that this v a1 a2, so this, by that I mean this a1 a2 is not equal to 0, mean that you cannot find a pair of a1 and a2. You cannot find a pair of let me clarify this if I'm mixing up the language. Collection is yes, you cannot find a pair of a1 and a2 such that this is always 0, which means for any pair of a1 and a2 it is always not equal to 0. So if that happens, then you say that the dimension of that vector space is 1. So similarly, now if you, let's say you find one pair of a1 a2, for this becomes equal to 0. So then clearly this vector space has two independent vectors. So then you call the dimension of that vector space to be 2. If you find a third vector like that, then you call the dimension of that vector space 3. So when we refer to a dimension of vector space, it becomes infinite. It becomes the number you get is coming from this definition. So now you can think again in the real number space. Again, I'm leaving this for you to think that if I say that this infinite dimensional real number space has this basis vector in these infinite directions as 1 0 0 0 0 0 0 1 0 0 0 0 0 like that, I can always find a set of these things which will lead me to 0. So think about this, that why it makes sense to call it an infinite dimensional vector space. So in a similar way, you can just look up some toy examples and learn to and try to convince yourself that this is always true. So I trust that you know these things. Okay, so I am going a little fast over this. Is that okay? Because somebody said that you took a course of somewhat abstract algebra where you learned some of these things. It's very elementary. I can assume it, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, very good. Now, this is also something you know, that any set of d linearly independent vectors in a d-dimensional vector space is a basis. So in the 3-dimensional Cartesian vector space, this is a basis, for example, the 3 x, y, and z direction. But you can also rotate this basis. So that will still be a basis. So that means there are infinitely many choices of constructing 3 linearly independent vectors in the 3-dimensional vector space, and that can be generalized for any d-dimensional vector space. So that is the point. So this is the definition of basis. Now the components are basically for every basis, given every basis, every vector that is not in this basis can be expressed in terms of these basis vectors. That you already know, it is very obvious. If you picturize it with the vectors, you know, but it is also a true statement at abstract level, that any arbitrary vector that is not part of a basis can be expressed like that. And these scalars which comes in front of this are basically the components of this vector, and that also satisfies the elementary, it also based on the elementary property of a vector, that if you multiply a vector by a scalar, it's still a vector, and you can add 2 vectors and that gives you another vector. It comes from that. Now the basis is orthonormal. We call that basis orthonormal. Not necessarily all basis is orthonormal, but all the basis we are familiar with are orthonormal. That is this, for example, again the 3D Cartesian basis. They must satisfy this property. And in a orthonormal basis, you can write the component by taking a scalar product between the vector itself, this vector itself, with its basis vector, just by taking a scalar product. These are all trivial things you already know. And you can go from one orthonormal basis to another by taking linear combination of the components. By that I mean, let's say you have a vector basis like that. So I call it, let's say, x1, x2, ... like xn. So you can take a linear combination. This is a linear combination. y1, let's say I call it y2, a21, x2, xn, and so on. So that is written in more complex form, that the y to a you can go by this multiplying by this a vector, a matrix, which is a11, a12, like that. So these linear combinations are expressed as a vector. So any orthonormal basis to another orthonormal can be, you can go by taking linear combination of vector, which you can write in a complex form in terms of this kind of matrix equation. And this linear combination is specified by, of course, these matrices are called orthonormal matrix, because this x vector satisfy this property that xTAx is equal to 1, and that comes from this. And this y is also orthonormal, so y also must satisfy this property, yty equal to 1. And in order to do that, this matrix, so I write it as A, it should be A in my present notation, it must satisfy this kind of property, where this y, x to y is given by this A. So here I have used a slightly defined notation. I called it V prime, V to B prime in terms of this M matrix. So it is like that. You know all this. I am not going into the details of this. Further details. It is already quite a bit of details. Now, what is the analogous phenomenon, analogous statement for this square integrable function space? The analogous statement is in terms of the Fourier basis. So you all know about Fourier expansion and Fourier transformation, right?
Sort of, sir. We did not have any formal introduction.
Yeah, but you know that if I give you an arbitrary function, you can express it in terms of a harmonic functions, which is e to the power ikx, or sine or cosine functions with some coefficient in front of that. You know that, right?
So we did not study general Fourier series at all. We
Like,
did
do you know
sine
this
and
kind
cos.
of thing? Fk e to the power ikx dx. Do you know this? That for any well-defined function, if it is fk, you can write it in terms of this, or in discrete way, you can say this e to the power ik k dot x fk, where the sum is over this n components of this. Do you know this kind of things?
No, sir, we didn't learn general Fourier series.
No, sir.
Okay, that's an assumption which I have to do something about it. So this kind of thing is called Fourier transformation. So I'll give you a reference, you read about it, and I'll cover it briefly in some pre-recorded lecture, okay? So this, you probably will learn a great detail about it in the mathematical physics course, and you don't need it right now at this point, but within a few days you will require it. So that's why I want you to learn it, but you can go to this book, Riley Hobson. Are you familiar with this book?
Yes, sir.
So go over this book and learn about this Fourier series and Fourier transformation. But I will also give you some kind of a tutorial on that. So this kind of thing tells you that. So for now, just know it as a statement of knowledge, like not as reasoning and argument. That the vector space of square integrable functions is infinite dimensional, that I already established it, and why it is so, because you can show that this recursive process of constructing linear independent set of vectors never ends. So that's why it is an infinite dimensional vector, because there are infinitely many linearly independent vectors you can find. And so let's say if I have an arbitrary function, so the basis of this is given by this kind of plane. These are called plane wave type of form. You know that e to the power ikx is a plane wave, right? From optics. Hello? Anyone?
Yes,
Yes, sir.
Okay. So it turns out that these plane waves provides a basis, an almost basis, because you can show that they cannot be normalized. So they are orthogonal but not normal. So they are not orthonormal. So they kind of provides an effective basis. So they are orthogonal but not square integrable. And I will show you a keyword to this problem, that how they can be represented correctly still to represent a physical state. And while it strictly satisfies all the criteria of being a vector, and every square integrable function can be completely specified by its Fourier coefficient, which is this statement, which I wanted to say, that and fk can, any fx can be taken to fk by multiplying it with this phi k with this definition of inner product, that is this. Like when I say a dot, a inner product, in this space, that means f and fkx are multiplied and integrated over the real number space. So that way, this thing is also forms, because of this Fourier basis, you can show that these functions are also vectors and satisfied all the properties of a vectors, and the plane wave serves as a basis for that. So just the way this kind of this regular vector space has a basis, okay, and they are orthogonal basis. How they becomes orthonormal, that requires one set of extra complexity. Okay, so this part is probably not super clear because I assume some prerequisite which is not there, which the assumption is wrong. So I will add some tutorial on this, and meanwhile you read this book of Riley Hobson for this particular thing. And I just want you to give the sense that this statement that a quantum mechanical state has to be represented by a vector, this statement is all across all the set of experiments or all the kind of description you have seen so far. One was in terms of a discrete space of spin half, which is the Stern-Gerlach. Another in terms of some continuous space plane waves, which is the double slit. Okay, so both of them are strictly mathematically vector space, and both of them has all the properties you need to be a vector space. So this first example was probably super clear. Second example needs some work. Okay, now coming to the quantum mechanics. So we already got the feel that quantum mechanical states are like vectors. They has to have these vector properties because we established this kind of a relation that we want this to happen. This is a vector, this is a vector, this is a scalar, this is a scalar. They are complex numbers. When combined, they should give me another state, which is some gamma. So a state should be thought of as a vector because the kind of object which gives this kind of properties are vectors. So we generated confidence in this direction. We will learn one more thing about this. They are not strictly vectors. They are something called projective vectors or rays. They are called rays. So in strictly mathematical sense, I will come to that point later, but let's just clarify that they are vectors, and then they must satisfy one more strict criteria, which just in mathematical sense they are called rays. But for time being, let's work with the working definition, which is that they are vectors. They are very close to that, but they are strictly not a vector. So, and this is, you should not think it as some weird mathematical object. So think of it like that to describe a certain kind of thing, you need a certain kind of mathematical structure. As I said, so for example, if you want to count discrete object, like you want to count how many marbles I have, how many marbles you have, you need the natural number. You need the natural number space, which can never be 0, which can never be minus. So natural number is this 1, 2 to n. Okay, these are called natural number space. So it is written with some double n or something like that. Now let's say you want you want to add to, so that is what human being first invented numbers was this. So they never needed the concept of a 0 initially, because you if you add things and you do things like initially you multiply or you don't need anything else. But then at some point of time people realize that if you remove something from something, there is nothing left. So you need a notion of that. So then you include the 0, and then you later realize if you try to remove something more from something, and then you have to have something like a negative number. This notion of subtraction also needs a negative number. So then you extend this number space. Okay, I don't know, it's a space of integers. And then if you want to divide, like you have some object you want to distribute among 3 people, two objects among 3 people. So you need more objects, more you need a structure which is more than integer. So then people came up with the concept of real number, because you want to divide things. So then the real number allows you to things to be fractional and all that. So that way, so then you know how this kind of things were developed. That when you encounter a new kind of requirement, you invent a new kind of space. So that is how you can think that quantum mechanics demands you to subscribe to a new kind of space, which is not so new because vectors are not so new when quantum mechanics was invented. But think it as that kind of a requirement, that you have encountered a class of phenomena in real world which needs a description, and that description demands a structure which is not just our regular numbers, regular vectors. It's a complex vector, and also it has a certain more peculiar property which is called projective property, which I'll come back to that. Okay, so now based on this intuition, so it is not anything extra. It is just for the set of phenomena you need a new structure. That's it. So the state of a quantum particle is given by a wave function psi xt, and so we understood that we already established that from our previous description of the experiments. And the probability of finding the particle at position x at time t has to be square of that. So this is the probability amplitude, this is the probability. We established the need of that. And we also realized that since it's a probability and it is certain that the particle is somewhere in the space, in the full space. So that means these probabilities must add up to 1 if you add all the possibilities. So then if you do that, then it must represent this point, which is the equivalent to saying that sum of p is equal to 1, sum of pi, okay, of all the possible states. So this wave function lies in the space of square integral function, as you must have noticed. So therefore it's a vector space. So even in the wave function it forms a vector space. So how you generalize? So we can generalize it by saying the state of any quantum mechanical particle or quantum state is a vector in some space, and we have also realized the some space is basically complex. Okay, so this is something we have already realized. So now a more formal way to do that is introduce this Bra-Kate notation. So Bra-Kate allows you to make this thing more structured. So let's say we know that if I have two vectors v and b, I can define an inner product like that. So if I have a vector v, I need to define another vector v transpose in order to define an inner product. Why so? Because this v vector is, let's say, some column vector. Then in order to multiply this, we need a row vector, which is nothing but transpose of this vector. Then we can multiply component by component and get this scalar product. So it tells you every vector has a dual vector, which is its transpose, the mathematical language of saying that it's a transpose of that, and such that the inner product gives you the scalar. For complex vector, this same thing is equivalent to saying it is v dagger v, because to get square you need a complex conjugate. So it's v dagger v, and these things are called Hermitian conjugate. It's the same thing, except it's complex. Now Dirac introduced the notation that this vector is represented by something called Kate, and this dual object, the dual mirror, is basically, he thought it as like a mirror of that. It's a bra. So it's a Kate vector, this is a bra vector. So every vector has a partner bra vector, every Kate vector has a partner bra vector, and every quantum mechanical state is represented by this Kate, either Kate vector or bra vector. So you have two descriptions, two way to describe every quantum mechanical state, and they satisfy the property that these bra and Kate vectors, when they see each other, they produce a complex number, just like this. So it is here I have written it like a same vector, but it could be also w dagger v. Okay? So it's just like this. So this dual vector works like that. So now again I can go to a transformation of basis. So now I can think of a concept called operators. So so let's think what does this operator do in a mathematical sense, and then we will try to understand that how it makes sense physically. So what is the job of operator? The job of operator is to take a basis and transform it into another new set of vectors. So this is my basis. Then I make a linear combination. As I establish that this linear combination also have to be a vector. So there is nothing wrong in saying this linear combination is another vector. I call them y1 to yn. So this linear combination have some scalar coefficient which I can write it as a vector A, as a matrix A, and that is just this. So a operator is something that takes a basis and transfer into another new set of vector. So you can think it intuitively, and I will establish that in a moment later, that what an act of operation do. An act of operation basically projects a state into another state. So if you go back to the Stern-Gerlach experiment, you will see that every time you operate, you project into one of these states. So that is equivalent to saying you take a state and you send it to another state. And then how you do that? To do that, we realize that we need a matrix to do that. So a very intuitive way to think about that, an act of an operator which is equivalent to something that when you perform a measurement should be represented by a matrix. So that is the intuitive build-up. So now let's go to go back to its linear properties, and then we will see how you establish that precisely for a measurement. Okay, how you will try various things to do, and then you will realize that the best way to represent a measurement is in terms of a Hermitian operator. So that is what we will try to do. So we have very few minutes left, so let me just quickly go over this. So if the new set, so first realize that, so you started with a set of vectors which forms a basis, and you cannot guarantee that the new vector you get will also be a basis. It will be just some another set of vectors. But if you demand that this y's also has to be a basis, so they have to satisfy certain property like orthonormality and all, then you can show. So this is something I expect you to know. If not, try to prove it. So this, if you want this yi's to be linearly independent, the determinant must be non-zero, determinant of this transformation. That counts very simply for the properties of linear equations. Now we know that addition and multiplication of a vector by a scalar are the only things you can do to generate another vector, which fits with this property. So if you want to get a vector from a vector, the only two operations you can do is add those vectors or multiply them by a scalar, and that is what you did. So these are basically called linear operations, and that is given in a compressed form like this matrix form. So any linear vector that takes an orthonormal basis to another orthonormal is an orthonormal transformation. I already did that proof. Basically, we already talked about this before, and this is very easy to show. So just try to show this, okay? And if it is complex, you need it to be unitary. This is orthonormal if it is real, or if complex, you need it to be unitary. So these are the two things. So let me spend another 1 minute just to give an outline of what is coming, and then I'll stop. Okay. So now in this part, we will try to establish that the act of a measurement, the result of a measurement on a quantum state. So first of all, you know this intuitively, that if you measure, you should get a real number, right? You cannot get anything weirder than that. A measurement should produce a real number. At the end of the day, any measurement one should be able to quantify in terms of a simple real number. So starting from a quantum mechanical state V, which is a vector, how you can get a scalar? What are the ways to get a scalar starting from a V? Think like a classical system, because a classical system, let's say, it has a position and momentum. When you measure it, you give some numbers at a given instant of time. You quote a number. So the position of a particle at time this is here, some number. Okay. Something similar should happen here, because at the end of the day, we realize an act of measurement produces a number and that's what it happens. So how many ways you can get, what are the possible ways you can get a number starting from a quantum state or a vector? So one way is this, taking an inner product with itself, but it just represents a single value. So that single value cannot give a generalized measurement. It cannot either be this, because if you do that, this W and V has some arbitrary prefactors, allowed prefactors, and that is a problem. That doesn't give you an uniqueness. And secondly, it also involves two different states. You don't want that. You want to know that if you perform a measurement on a given state, how can you generate a number? You cannot involve two different states. For same reason, it cannot be either this, because this WAB. So convince yourself this thing is neither real nor unique, and it of course involves two different states. It has three non-desirable properties. So it turns out the quantity which fits all the requirements is this. It's something like this, which is basically you take a kate, you multiply it with an operator, and then you multiply it with a bra. So that gives you a scalar. It doesn't have any of these problems. It doesn't have an arbitrary phase, because that whatever phase it has, it's cancelled by here, and that represents a physical requirement of an act of measurement, which means it produces a scalar without any ambiguity. Okay, so how do you physically interpret this kind of a quantity? How do you physically interpret a quantity which looks like this? Can you say it's an observable A with value this in a classical sense? So that's why we say, right, if I have an observable A, let's say the position or the momentum, when I measure, it produces a value BAB, like, or some number which is equivalent to BAB here. Can you do something like that here? It turns out no, you cannot. Why no? Think about it, and we will take it over from here in the next class. I think right now we are running out of time. So that is all I wanted to do today. So how do you interpret an object like that? You cannot interpret an object like that in the same language as classical. You have to introduce something else. You have to call it something else. So think about what you can do. Also do some reading of basic linear algebra. Brush your linear algebra from some mathematical physics book. Brush a bit of Fourier transformation from Riley-Hobson, and read Dirac's book. That is the most strongly recommended book. You can also read Sakurai, Sakurai or Shankar, but I think there is a big difference in the approach of these books from Dirac, because Dirac tells you the train of thought which leads to this. Any other book will give you just what is what, not the train of thought which leads to this. Okay, so that's all. Any questions for Ram? No questions? Okay, so that's all for today. You can stop the recording.